I think one of the misconceptions about more affordable lenses is that you only use them when you can't afford the more expensive alternatives. And I can tell you for myself and many other photographers out there, this is not the case. And in fact, I have a number of more expensive lenses that cover the same focal length, and I often prefer to use this lens, specifically because I really like the image quality, and it has nothing to do with the price. So even if you're on a budget and can't afford lenses that cost more than $100, you can still get a lens that some photographers are choosing over lenses that cost 5 or 10 times the price. Now, more expensive lenses will often get you things that these cheaper lenses won't, but pure image quality and image rendering is not one of them. Image quality, or the type of images that you prefer, is subjective. So you might prefer images out of this cheap lens over a lens that costs $2,000, like a Sony G Master lens. This is completely personal preference. And I think when I start talking about these vague terms like personal preference or image rendering, you're immediately going to think this lens is soft. It's not. It's very sharp. It's even sharp on a test chart. So if you are a pixel peeper, you aren't wasting your time watching this video. Recently, I went on a once-in-a-lifetime family trip, something that can't be repeated or recaptured, and I chose to use this very inexpensive lens for a large portion of the photos. And that's not only because I really like the way it renders images, but also because of the size of the lens and the form factor. Most of my more expensive lenses that cover the same focal length are also autofocus lenses, and in most situations, I prefer to use manual focus lenses, which is what this lens is. Of course, there are times when autofocus lens makes a lot more sense, so I had my autofocus lenses with me and I used them in those situations, but for about 75% of the time that I'm doing photography or video, I'm shooting with manual focus lenses. And anyone that thinks manual focus is just too hard, keep in mind the photos that you're going to see in this video were all taken with manual focus. For most of the history of photography, we only had manual focus, and the biggest budget Hollywood movies today are shot almost exclusively on manual focus lenses. This is absolutely something you are capable of doing with a little bit of practice, and you can get good at it very, very quickly. This lens works on most of the popular mirrorless mounts. It works on full frame or APS-C sensor cameras. I'll put some links in the description down below to the best pricing I could find on the lens and all the available mounts. And although I did buy this lens with my own money, this is a 50mm f2 lens by TT Artisan, and TT Artisan has sent me lenses in the past. Now, first I want to talk about what gives this lens its interesting image character that I like so much. And the first thing that you're going to notice in the photos, particularly if you're shooting wide open, it has heavy vignette with very dark corners, and that vignette creeps almost all the way to the middle of the frame when you're shooting wide open. Now, on a 50mm lens, I like vignette, and particularly if I'm shooting a 50mm lens wide open at f2, I'm going to be adding vignette in post or in editing anyways. So by having a lens that has heavy vignette, particularly wide open, when I'm looking through the viewfinder or I'm looking on the back of the screen, I am getting a more accurate representation of the way that I'm generally going to edit a 50mm f2 photo anyway. So this lens absolutely leans into the way that I would edit those photos. And for people that don't edit their photos and don't add vignette, and they want some of that interesting image character straight out of camera, straight out of their JPEGs, there really isn't a way to do that in camera. It's something that needs to be done optically, and this lens is going to give you this heavy vignette look. Now, once you stop the aperture down a bit, even at f2.8, it's significantly improved, but you still have reasonably dark corners, and the dark corners stay no matter how much you stop it down. So this is another part of the interesting look this lens gives you. This at f8, and this is not uncommon with smaller lenses like this, even at f8, you have dark corners. And that is going to draw attention to the things that are in the middle 2/3 or 3/4 of the frame. And it kind of just draws the viewer's eye and gives them a subject in there. And generally speaking, with a 50mm lens, we don't have to worry about the corners anyways, because it's not like a super wide lens where we're doing landscape and we're going to be putting things in the corner that we want the viewers to pick out. Generally, with a 50mm lens, we're probably going to have something in the middle 2/3 or 3/4 of the frame, and your attention is just drawn to that part of the image by the heavy vignette. But I should say this is considered an optical flaw. If you are watching any videos on YouTube or you're watching any of these lens reviews, they're going to tell you vignette is a flaw. Yes, it is an optical flaw, but it is one that I intentionally add when editing photos out of similar lenses. So It's not one that I mind, and I actually think it makes the images look better. The next thing I want to talk about is contrast, because lenses of this price point generally are not going to have the same lens coatings that more expensive Sigma, Sony, or Canon lenses have. And because of that, they don't tend to be as high contrast. And what you'll find is these lenses render contrast very similar to some of the more modern vintage lenses. So just kind of at the end of the DSLR days, like a Canon FD lens. And in fact, I shot this next to my Canon FD f1.4, and I found the image quality was very, very similar. So you're getting this kind of mix between a modern lens and a vintage lens. But the important thing about this is even though you get slightly lower contrast, you still get true colors and you still get a punchy image with good colors. In addition to that, you still get a sharp image, which is very, very important. And even wide open at f2 in the center of frame, the images coming out of this lens are very, very sharp. Yes, there are sharper lenses out there, but not by some major margin. And so right from f2, it is usable, super sharp in the center of frame. Now, as you get to the corners, you start to get this focus fall off, where when you get to the extreme corners, it is starting to get blurry. Once again, this is part of the look that this lens gives you. So you have dark corners, you have slightly blurry corners, and you get this kind of, particularly at f2, you get this area of fall off of focus that goes to the corners and just slightly gets to the edges of frame. And this just kind of draws the viewer's eye to that center 3/4 of the image. As you stop the lens down, those corners clean up. And if you shoot it at f11, you can actually clean up the corners until they're quite sharp, basically as sharp as the center of frame. So if you are shooting like product or landscape or something like that, or food, and you want everything to be in focus and you want sharp corners, you do have the ability to stop it down and get that. But I think leaning in to these soft, dark corners is part of the image quality this lens gives you. And when you look at the images that I throw up in this video, you will notice that that is a big part of the image quality. The next thing about this lens, which was really surprising, was the quality of the bokeh and background blur, and particularly how round the bokeh balls were shot wide open all the way to the edges of frame. Now, I don't mind a lens that gives you those lemon-shaped swirly bokeh going to the corners of frame. I actually think that looks kind of cool. And generally, that's what you get out of less expensive lenses. But this lens has like these perfectly round bokeh balls going all the way to the edge and corner of frame, which is generally unusual for less expensive lenses. And so it has an interesting sort of clinical, clean bokeh quality that then kind of works with this less clinical dark corners and soft edges of frame, which gives you an image that I don't see out of a lot of lenses. In fact, I can't off the top of my head think of another lens that gives you clean round bokeh, but then has the dark corners and the focus fall off towards the corners. So it's those combination of factors that gives this lens what I think is quite an interesting image quality. And although some of these qualities are optical imperfections, you might actually like the images that come out of the lens, like I do. And in those cases, they aren't imperfections, they are actually features. So those are the features that really give this lens its specific look, but I'll take you through the other optical performance as well. Looking at distortion, you do get a little bit of pincushion distortion. It's nothing major, and I wouldn't worry about correcting it in editing. It's really only noticeable if you get a straight line close to the edge of frame. Chromatic aberration is generally a place that we see these cheap lenses suffer. But I think maybe because this is an f2 lens and not an f1.4 lens, there's basically little to none. Like I just could not pick out any. And even when I was shooting heavily backlit scenes, maybe I saw the most modest amount when I zoomed in, but I thought the performance was fairly clinical and really in line with much more expensive lenses. In fact, I've got $1,000, $1,500 lenses that have far worse chromatic aberration performance than this lens does. When we look at longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is a shift in color cast before and after the plane of focus, you will often see this if you have a tree and that tree is out of focus and backlit. You might get some fringing or color fringing. And this does exhibit a little bit of that, but it's only in the most extreme situations. In real world situations, I didn't notice it at all. Now looking at the flare performance, and I think this is something goes along with that contrast performance because it really relates to the lens coatings and the lens. And you do get some crazy rainbow flares, and at times this can totally wash out your image. Now, interestingly, if the light source is in the frame, that is, the lens is seeing it and it's in your photo, it actually does an exceptional good job of holding its contrast. And you can totally shoot with sun in the scene or streetlights in the scene, and it's absolutely fine. The times when you will have problem is when that light gets just out of frame and it's cutting across the lens. Then you can get a situation where the color of that light will wash across the whole image, or you might get a completely desaturated image. Now, interestingly enough, this is kind of easy to actually fix by just taking your hand and shading the lens from that light source. So the fact that it performs really well with those lights in the scene, but doesn't out, is a bit of a blessing. The other thing is you can actually intentionally have that side light coming in to wash a color or color of that light over your scene to bring on flare on purpose, just depending on what kind of look you're going for. But if I were to just say what is the weakest optical performance of this lens, it would definitely be flare. The lens also has a little bit of a kind of a bonus mode. If you stop it down to f11 or f16 at night and you shoot kind of a long exposure, you're going to get really cool sun stars that have these like really cool points and streaks of light that go all across the frame. And really, it's its strongest at f16. It starts at f8 or f11. Most of the shots I'm showing you were shot at f16 just to bring it on at its strongest. But it is kind of a cool look, particularly when you're street lights at night or a city or something like that. Once again, just kind of a bonus mode. The other thing you might use a lens like this for is close-up images, and the close-up image quality is very good. It's a little bit sharper at f2.8 than it is f2, but importantly, when you shoot close-up images, they are good. There are some particularly less expensive lenses out there that when you get close to the subject, you lose all your sharpness, detail, and image quality. This holds up really, really well. It's usable at f2, better at f2.8 or f4, which is generally you stop the aperture down when you're shooting close anyways to get you a little bit deeper depth of field, but it's usable across the entire aperture range. So if you're out traveling and shooting something and you want to get some of those close-up details, it's going to do that for you. The minimum focus distance isn't very close, though. That's probably the biggest disadvantage. I think it's about 1.5 feet or around 50 centimeters, something like that. So you're not going to get as close as you might with some other comparable lenses. Looking at the build on the lens, it is an all metal lens. It has a polished metal lens mount. It definitely feels more expensive than its sub $100 price point. It has a clicked aperture ring, which I prefer, particularly when I'm just traveling or shooting street photography. It just kind of settles in and stays in place, and you know that it won't easily get knocked out of place. And the focus throw is 1/2 turn, which I'm actually finding works perfectly with this lens. Now, you do get quite a bit of focus breathing, which is not unusual for small lenses like this. So if you're pulling focus in video, you might notice that. But for general purpose photography, which is mainly what I would use this lens for, it's not an issue. And once again, the way the focus ring is geared is really perfect. It made it super easy to nail focus. So I think even somebody who doesn't have a lot of manual focus experience will have reasonably good luck with this lens. Once again, for pricing and availability, there'll be links in the description down below. Now, I've just thrown a video on screen now. This is a 35mm f1.4 lens. This is the cheapest f1.4 lens you can buy that covers full frame, and the images are really, really cool. It's kind of a mix between a modern lens and a vintage lens. Has some similar optical traits to this one, but it's a 35mm lens, and it goes to f1.4 as well.